challenge of my presentation is how to talk about something that's probably been talked about a lot in this conference, and I think there are some upcoming sessions that are going to talk about it some more and in greater detail, and do that in 20 minutes. I think what I'm going to do is going forward, I'm going to skip through some slides just so that I get to the points that I want to make that I feel have not been discussed and that I think are important as we explore this new phenomena of compulsory licensing in India. So what I'm asking everyone to do is, in addition to the hats that you're wearing as a common citizen, as a patent agent, as an Indian attorney, as an Indian citizen, as representatives of multinational pharma, is to put on this sort of policy hat while you are talking and you're thinking about compulsory licensing. Compulsory licensing basically became a reality March of 2012. Up until then, it was speculation, it was discussion, it was people trying to figure out what's going to happen, is it going to be good, is it going to be bad? But there were battle lines drawn prior to March 2012, but now those lines are more concrete. You have people taking either side of this battle. It was very interesting that one reporter actually reported it as setting off a tidal wave. I don't think it's that bad. I think just the fact that it has sent ripples through the multinational pharma companies that have actually looked at India as a very lucrative market, and now they're stepping back and trying to figure out what their strategy is going to be. But it puts into perspective as to how important, at least within the context of India, the issue of compulsory licensing is. It's going to take some time to load up, but I won't discuss what this tidal wave is because it was meant to define what we mean by compulsory licensing, but I think we all know by now. It's forced, it's mandated by the government. These were going to be primary grounds that sort of I've collected based on what's happened in other jurisdictions, or at least what's been talked about. But again, to go through these would sort of take away from the point that I want to make, so I'm going to skip through this slide. Getting here, I think the point that I want to underscore with this slide is that there, as under the Paris Convention and under TRIPS, the Indian Patents Act, sections 84 through 92, actually do a pretty decent job in covering what is required to get a compulsory license. I mean, there are arguments, and I think there could be a side discussion on whether India's compulsory licensing sections comply with the spirit of Article 27. But essentially, I think the section of the Indian Patents Act has done a very good job in covering the four corners of what would essentially be required to grant a compulsory license. The salient features of the NATCO decision, Mr. Singh was kind enough to discuss that, so I won't go through that. And again, this is a case that's been discussed, it will be discussed, and that's not the point of this presentation. I am not talking about the merits of the Bayer versus NATCO case, but I'm talking about what we need to do in light of this case coming to the foreground of the IPR regime in India. So the first step is to go and look at reactions. I think the most critical reaction that I read about with respect to this case was one of the professors and then a couple of people have echoed this, is that even with the price that NATCO is going to sell it at, the drug is still not going to be available to a large number of cancer patients that needs the drug. And for the multinational pharma company, that's a great point. I mean, if you're looking at it from their perspective, they're saying, look, you're coming here, you're telling us affordable price, affordable healthcare, patients across the country, but hey, this is not going to be affordable to many of the patients. So how do you counter that, that theory or that argument that the multinationals are going to come up with? There is obvious goodwill, and there's obvious good things that are going to come out of compulsory licensing, and a lot of people feel that the government should have that power to do that, which is, I think, a fair assessment of where India is. Another point that was made is the fact that we cannot look at compulsory licensing as a tool to solve the problems that the government needs to be solving with respect to providing affordable healthcare. affordable healthcare and affordable medicine are two different things. And I think that to be able to say that compulsory licensing is a tool to allow you to provide affordable healthcare is wrong. I think we have to look at it as a tool to provide affordable medicines, but the burden of providing affordable healthcare still lies with the government, and they cannot use compulsory licensing as a tool to achieve that goal. These are some additional reactions. And I think the last one is, again, a point that has been underscored in a couple of other presentations that I've been through, is that you have to strike the right balance. When India decided to become TRIPS compliant, and they had until January 1st, 2005 to do that, they made a conscious decision to move forward in a certain regime with respect to intellectual property rights. And I think it is our responsibility to be able to come up with laws and policies that actually balances giving the multinationals or the patentees the power to get money out of what they invent, but at the same time balance what is public policy in India. And public policy in India is very important because we have a very big socialist aspect, in our government, in the running of our country. And I think that for us to become a pure capitalistic environment like the US, and we've seen a lot of pushback from the US saying compulsory licensing is wrong, you're implementing it wrong, that's the wrong way to go about it. And I think that that theory has to take a step back and has to put into perspective where the Indian economy is, where the Indian social structure is. And I think for the Indian social structures, compulsory licensing at this point is what I would term a necessary evil. It's necessary because we needed to spur certain things in our economy, in our quest to give good health care to people. But it's an evil because I think if it is not managed properly, it will send us down the wrong path. And 10 years from now, we will be thinking about the fact that we should not have done what we did. So in the end, I think compulsory licensing right now is all about big pharma versus generic predators. I don't think there are many people who are going to disagree with that. But before we get into discussing what this is about, you have to take a look at the pharmaceutical industry in India. It's a $21 billion industry, but it's only 2.4% of the global pharmaceutical industry. So it's big if you look at it in terms of what you would qualify as an underdeveloped or a developing nation. I, for one, have no qualms in believing that India is not only is it a developing nation, it is on the upper side of developing nations. So to the extent that we sort of play this game, I think we like to call ourselves underdeveloped when we want to capitalize on an opportunity like compulsory licensing. And there are other opportunities where we get offended if somebody says that, well, India is an underdeveloped nation. I think we have to recognize that we are developing, and we are developing fast, and we are almost there to sort of consider ourselves as getting to the level of being a developed nation. And I think that's why compulsory licensing as a tool has to be managed effectively. We're a very, very big generics market, producer of generics drugs. 20% of the market is controlled by the Indian pharma industry, and I think that's why we like compulsory licensing. It helps our generic companies. And I think that it's good that it helps our generic companies, but it has to give them the launching board that they, in my opinion, are not capitalizing on right now. We produce a lot of medicine. We have a very large population, and so of course we have to produce those large numbers of medicines. But in terms of value of production, we're not that great. Again, that goes to say that we're not producing the medicines that's actually bringing in the money. And I'll talk about this a little bit in detail later. We have 20,000 registered companies that do some form of drug development. That is a staggering number of companies. So we cannot fall back and say, look, we're underdeveloped, we need all this. We need some innovation, we need some technology input, and I think that was one of the underlying principles of compulsory licensing, that you have to allow countries like India and countries in Africa and other Asian countries the ability to use that innovation that is being patented elsewhere to spur their economy. And I think that is the point that that compulsory licensing allows us, and we have to try to achieve that. There are very obvious benefits of compulsory licensing. I think the biggest one is with respect to medicine. It provides you access, quick access, and it provides you cheap access to medicines that are invented abroad. The long-run effects are actually unclear, although I found one study that has said that if you allow for compulsory licensing 10 years from now, the domestic innovation market is going to improve and you will feel the effects 10 years from now. And again, this is speculative. I think most people will say that it's unclear, we really don't know what's going to happen. And if you're big pharma, you're probably saying the opposite of this, that it's not going to happen. You guys are walking down the wrong path. This slide is actually the crux of what I'm trying to get at. So what are the risks? We have to identify the risks every time we get into a discussion. In the discussions that I've got onto people, and maybe this is you know, I've talked to on this topic with people that actually have not been wearing these multiple hats that I'm asking people to do. They've been very clear with which side of the line they're on. But I think I'm more in the center because I think there's good and bad going either ways, and it has to be a case-by-case decision. You cannot be a blanket pro compulsory licensing or completely against it. As with any other country, we have to make sure that compulsory licensing is not used as a tool to sort of favor vested interests of political groups or companies. That's important in India because politics plays a big part in everything that happens in India. It's important in India because there are, like I said, there are 20,000 registered companies, and you have to give them some work compulsory license. So when you create that diversion, it creates a disincentive for those companies to come and say, let me look at this market, let me try to invest in this market. There's no ownership of the market in India. There's impaired distribution of drugs because if you look at, let's take even the NATCO case. Granted, they're going to be selling the drugs, they're going to be probably selling it at a reasonable price. But can we guarantee that the distribution, that the supply chain, the cost, the quality is actually going to be managed the way the controller's decision wants it to? At what price it is actually going to be sold to the end user? We can only speculate about that because we don't know how the market works. We don't know how the distribution chain works. There's nothing in the compulsory license that talks about the quality of the drug that is going to be provided to cure this disease. So those are questions that we have to think about. If you're going to allow compulsory licensing, do we have the right infrastructure in place to make sure that these things are happening? For me, the big thing is the shifting of the responsibility on, and I say multinational private enterprise here, but because that's the case right now. But I think the Indian companies, as they grow, they are going to go into this sort of area of being innovators. Then what? You know, why are we shifting this burden on them? And I think this is a comment that a couple of other people have also made, is that by allowing generic companies to produce drugs at lower prices, all the government is doing is it's shifting its burden. Now we have to look at it in a better way. If we take the example of Canada, and that's a difficult example to take because Canada, and Marcus would probably be able to tell us more about this if you have questions, but Canada applied compulsory licensing. It had these major compulsory licensing, and it went into the NAFTA agreement, and it got rid of that agreement, but now Canada says, don't do it. We've done it, we're telling you don't do it. If you tell that to somebody, a policymaker or a bureaucrat in India, the first thing they'll do is like, there's something wrong here. Why are you telling us not to do it? We should have the freedom to do it.
If I could just interject,
yes.
That's because the United States bullies us a lot more than they bully you.
I think the US is trying to bully us too, but that's the thing. We have to get into a constructive evaluation and to see why Canada did that, what benefits were achieved out of it, whether that's going to apply to India, and whether it makes sense to actually not do it or to do it to the extent that Canada did it. And put the responsibility on the government of India, and that's tough. I think everybody here who knows about how the government functions knows that it is tough. Our political and bureaucratic environment is not very conducive to this, but we have to try, and we have to make sure that the government takes responsibility of what it should. There's impaired incentive to develop new drugs because now this is the classic, do you teach a man how to fish or do you feed him a fish if he's hungry? You know, are you going to tell the generic companies, here, take it on a platter and develop it, and produce it and sell it? Or are you going to tell them, we'll let you do some of it for the really important and the life-threatening drugs, but it is your burden to make sure that you have the right innovative processes in place to become innovators and actually get into research and development. And the last one is, if you use or sort of abuse the power of compulsory licensing, you're going to get reduced investment from multinational companies, which India is already seeing. I've sort of highlighted these two because I think these two are critical. How much are the generic companies investing in R&D, and how much of the multinational R&D expenditures are we getting in India? Yes, domestic R&D expenses has actually grown 40-fold in the last 10 years, but it's only 6% of sales. And if you look at this, I mean, it's a very busy chart. It's very difficult to read, but I think the bottom line is it's an average of 6% of sales is what the Indian pharma companies are investing into R&D, but this is not on new drugs. This is on drug formulations, on the processes or the procedures they can use to circumvent patents so that they can sell the generics. I think that impetus has to change. I think it is incumbent on the generic companies to become the innovators, and that's how we can challenge the multinationals, not necessarily only through compulsory licensing. By contrast, you have between 15 and 20% is what the big pharma are investing. And this is percentage. This is not the dollar amount. The dollar amounts are vastly different. So is India's loss of this, because now what's happening is the multinationals are not investing in India. China is getting all this money. This is a snapshot I got from a McKinsey report on India Pharma. They had projected something for 2015, and you see all the money that these big pharma are investing, and none of this is coming to India. And when I was discussing this with somebody who deals with pharmaceutical companies, consults with them as the director at McKinsey, and sort of a very senior individual in India, his response was, but who really cares? Does the average Indian on the road really care that Pfizer is investing $175 million in China and not in India? His problem or her problem is, can I afford the medicine for my father, for my sister, for my daughter? And I think that's where the disconnect is, and that's why it's about affordable healthcare. It's not about pricing of medicines. And we cannot look at just these small things as, do we have enough R&D investments? Are we selling it at the right prices? I think we need more involvement from all stakeholders, from the government, to improve that thought that people have and make them start caring about these issues. There's one author that actually said this, and I don't agree with this, but I thought I should put it in all fairness because I'm trying to take the middle ground. So one author says that there is no risk of decreasing investment in research in developing countries because they're not the market for the big pharma in any case. I think for India and China specifically, that's not the right picture because our numbers are so huge that we are an interest for all the big pharma. Because if we weren't, they would have packed up the bags and left. Novartis wouldn't be appealing 3D at the Supreme Court. Bayer would not be fighting the compulsory licensing decision. I think we're important. India is important. And you know, it's here to stay in sort of the business environment of the multinational pharma. So what some of the things we could think of, how to supplement the compulsory licensing provisions. I think the first one is very important from the multinational perspective. When you talk about compulsory licensing, it's an issue of fixed cost versus marginal pricing. What the multinationals are essentially saying, look, we have a very high fixed cost in bringing a drug to market. It varies based on what the drug is and how much expenditure they've had, but they say we have a very high cost. When you let somebody, if you give somebody a compulsory license to make this drug, they're making it at a marginal pricing which we cannot compete. But I think that if the big pharma get into a mindset, and some have set down that path, others are choosing not to go down that path, is if they can recover their fixed price and they price it marginally above that, I think they will meet that reasonableness requirement that the Indian Act has. Whether they actually will or not, time will tell, but I think that at least on paper, they're trying their best to meet that reasonableness requirement. Again, putting the burden on the government. Why should the government not think about purchasing these drugs at that higher price? so that the big pharma is happy. Again, give them the fixed price plus a marginal cost. Don't give them the fixed price plus the 400% that they want. Give them the fixed price so that they can cover the cost and they can continue to invest in their R&D. Give them the marginal price. Government of India buys the drugs and says, okay, we are going to take the hit and we are going to use this as a way to reduce the cost of medicines for the people who can't afford it. Till such time, our companies start innovating and making drugs so that we don't have to rely on the Novartis and the pharma and the Pfizers and the Bayers for the new drugs. Insert government into the licensing decisions. I was having a conversation with Brett earlier on, and he was telling me that Australia has a compulsory licensing provision that's not been used, that probably never will be used. But it's a good deterrent. Why don't we think of compulsory licensing as a deterrent? Why doesn't the government come in and say, look, we're going to use it against you. So unless you big pharma decide you want to help us because we have this crisis, we're going to use it against you. And I think that you'll be surprised as to the number of companies that will actually come and sit on the table and try to get into that discussion. And the last point, which is a separate topic completely, is working. We have to look at the working requirement. We have to change the working requirement to make it better suited to the global patent environment. So my parting thoughts are that the reality of the situation is compulsory licensing is here. It's here to stay. We have to be able to manage it. We have to be able to balance the private rights versus the public good. We have to use it as a way of figuring out what our structural problems are. We have to, within reason, make it clear and impartial, and make sure that it's not the monster that people make it out to be. I think the West has to come down from their position, because we have sort of this moral high ground about providing medicine to the general public. So, and we have to come off our moral high ground, and I think we have to engage in a discussion as equals, and if you engage in a discussion as equals, there's a lot that can be achieved. Thank you.